Hello, Robs. We're back with Anyone's Son, a true story by Roberta Roche with Harry De La Roche Jr., the killer, who is going to trial at this point. On Saturday, John made the first of several unsuccessful motions for a mistrial. The first one was on the basis I hadn't been advised of my rights after I became the suspect, but Judge Madden denied the motion, and the trial continued with O'Donovan on the stand. Many exhibits were brought out that day, and as they were introduced into evidence, I had to look at blood-soaked bed linen, blood-stained carpet samples, and recovered bullets taken from the house. There were also testimony on the fingerprints that were taken, the paraffin test I didn't get, and the mileage between my Montvale house and the Maximus. The cops only clocked the shortest distance, yet I took a longer route home. The black guy I met at the bar came up for discussion for a while, and I'd like to know, since the state had my wallet with the guy's name and address, why no one tried to contact him and ask the exact time I left. Why wasn't the address turned over to my lawyer? Why weren't a lot of things done? Under cross-examination, O'Donovan admitted he'd never tried to contact the guy to see how long he was with me. Toward the end of the day, State Police Detective Leroy Smith, a fingerprint specialist, who stated he'd seen 20,000 fingerprints in his career, took the stand and described discovering Ronnie's body. He testified to dusting the locker for fingerprints, but the judge recessed the trial till Monday before Smith could tell the jury whose fingerprints he'd found. Monday was my mother's birthday, and one of the exhibits that really hurt was the yellow nylon pajamas she was wearing when she was shot. A court table behind the counsel tables was filled with cardboard boxes and crumpled paper bags which the prosecution had brought as evidence in a large shopping cart. There were wood chips from the attic floor and steps, the gun and the towel that was wrapped around it, bullets from Eric's and Ronnie's skulls, white long johns, and a Citadel t-shirt, and Ronnie's green G.I. Joe box. Some bags contained the undershorts my father and brothers had been wearing. When Detective Smith got back on the stand, he testified he'd lifted 3 fingerprints off the metal locker door. Then he told the jury he matched one fingerprint made by my left index finger with copies of the fingerprints that were taken at police headquarters. So far, this fingerprint identification was the most incriminating physical evidence the jury had heard about. But why shouldn't my fingerprint be there? It's logical my father, Ronnie, and I would carry things to the attic. As far as the other fingerprints went, there were not enough characteristics present for Smith to make a match. While testifying about fingerprints, Smith also told the jury no fingerprints could be taken from the .22 pistol Detective John David found in the basement because it was too smeared with blood. Yet the very next day, a senior forensic chemist with the state police said there was only a small amount of blood on the gun. I think there were no fingerprints on the gun because of the towel that was wrapped around it. Stephen Coons, who had been an investigator in 1976 and who, at the time of the trial, was an assistant prosecutor, took the stand and testified he'd found the blood-stained long johns and Citadel t-shirt or shirt buried. Let's redo that. The stand and testified he'd found the blood-stained long johns and Citadel shirt buried beneath sweatshirts and sneakers at the rear of my closet. Then the state brought out Ronnie's green box and showed that it contained rolling papers for making marijuana cigarettes, a small scale, and 2 empty plastic bags. But no marijuana. Mr. Sulkin slammed it on the table and said, looking at the jury, "When you sell marijuana, you need marijuana to sell, right?" John implied that the evidence might have been tampered with. Then he looked in the box himself and pulled out a pair of scissors. The box also contained a few seeds, but they were too small to identify. Because of a 4-month delay by a state crime lab, the state really goofed on the blood tests, and most of them were inconclusive on the evidence taken from the house In fact, out of 45 pieces of evidence delivered to the state police by the Montvale police in November and December, only 9 items could be identified for blood type. When tests were performed on them in April. Please. Thank you. The 9 items that could be identified for blood type were 1. Ronnie's left hand, which showed type O and type A blood. 2. My mother's pajama top, which showed type O. 3. A mattress cover, which showed type O. 4. One piece of carpeting, which showed type A. 5. An undershirt, which showed type A. 6. A second undershirt, which showed type A. 7. A bedspread, which showed type A. 8. A sheet, which showed type A. 9. A second sheet, which showed type A. My father, Ronnie, and I were A. Eric and my mother were O. Gary Onken, a forensic chemist for the State Police Crime Labs, said the fingernail scrapings taken from Ronnie revealed the presence of human blood, but not in a large enough quantity to establish the blood group. There were several reasons why the blood tests were botched. The state police, the first to receive the bed linens, clothing, and other items, sent the evidence to the West Trenton State Police Lab. At the time, the prosecution requested no priorities, but probably assumed the lab would automatically give something of this nature priority. This didn't happen, however, and the evidence was kept on a shelf at the lab, waiting its turn in a 4 to 5 month backlog of cases. In April, the prosecutor's office put a rush order on the evidence, but between December and April, the blood was exposed to air, humidity, bacteria, and even detergent residue. All of this made the blood work pretty useless. This was unfortunate for the defense, because if the blood test had been conclusive, they could have helped determine whether Ronnie had significant amounts of blood on him from other family members. John objected to the blood type evidence and argued that the tests were too inconclusive. They had the information in November but did not do the test until April, he declared. Are you telling us you let your own evidence be destroyed? Lab tests on the .22 automatic were performed immediately after the deaths because the pistol was needed for ballistic tests. So John Nichols, another state police forensic chemist, identified type O on the pistol's magazine clip and muzzle. Blood tests on the towel wrapped around the pistol were inconclusive. The testimony on the blood tests was tedious, and by 9:45 a.m. I noticed a juror yawning. I often thought the jury looked bored, and one member rocked back and forth in his chair during the afternoon. On Wednesday, January 11th, Captain Matthew Sawtell, my tactical officer at the Citadel, was subpoenaed to testify about my emergency leave. He testified in full uniform, and I noticed that he looked at me when he took the stand. Dr. Lawrence Denson, the county medical examiner, was also a witness that day, and much of what he had to say was damaging to me. The jurors looked grim as they listened, and when really destructive testimony was given, I noted some jury members seemed to study me. Dr. Denson began by saying there was no trace of cancer in my mother's vital organs. Terminal cancer is usually very diffuse, he testified, and whitish material would be found in various organs. I could see a few of the jurors wince when Dr. Denson went on to say that Eric survived 2 bullets fired at close range and died when his skull was cracked open by a blunt object. He said powder burns on Eric's face showed he was shot with a gun held less than 2 inches from his face. Then he added that there were superficial wounds on the back of Eric's hands, which indicated he had been trying to fight off an assailant. When the prosecutor showed him the gun and asked if the gun could have caused skull injuries, Dr. Denson answered yes. This was a difficult day to take. Then on top of this, Dr. Denson said that the only place in my whole house where blood splatters caused by an object hitting a person with force were found was near Eric's body and on the t-shirt in my closet. To show that Ronnie, who was 5'8", might have been the one who had worn the clothes in the closet, John In the closet, John. Who's 1 inch taller than I am, suggested the bloody long johns. I see what he's saying now. Would be too short for me by holding the underwear up to his waist and walking in front of the jury as he asked Mr. Denson, "Are these the long johns?" "Worn by a tall man, a little short, aren't they, Doctor?" As soon as he finished speaking, Mr. Sulkin's investigator produced a second pair of long johns, the ones I had on when I was arrested. Mr. Sulkin took the second pair and held them next to the blood-stained ones. "The ones taken from De La Roche are actually shorter than the other pair, aren't they, Doctor?" he asked. Some spectators said I pursed my lips and let out a silent whistle when the prosecutor made this point. There's Dr. Denson. When he was testifying, Dr. Denson said he could not tell the exact time of death of any person, but he estimated it was about 3 a.m. Under questioning, however, he went on to say that the deaths could have been within an hour earlier and could have occurred at 2 a.m. Ronnie's time of death was put at 3 a.m. too, but since his body was still warm when it was found, Dr. Denson stated his death could have occurred 1 to 1.5 hours after the others when he was asked that question. The fact that my family could have been killed somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m. is something I think of a lot. A little after 4 a.m., the police were at my house, and at 2 a.m., I was still at the disco. Moreover, if Ronnie could have died up to 1.5 hours later than everybody else, why wasn't that checked out closer, since I stated that I shot Ronnie at approximately 3:30 a.m.? The day after Dr. Denson testified, the jury had a day off while we had a Miranda hearing to determine whether the investigating police detectives violated my constitutional rights to remain silent and consult a lawyer before the confession I later recanted. Throughout the day, various detectives from the Montvale Police and Prosecutor's Office took the witness stand and testified I had been given my rights and was aware of them before confessing to the slayings. From our side of the courtroom, John maintained I was not properly advised of my rights until I had already given a confession to Lieutenant Herbert H. Almers, the officer who gave me the polygraph test. Lieutenant Almers testified that before the polygraph test and before I signed my consent to take the test, he read a consent form that contained an extensively worded Miranda warning. When I signed the consent form, I waived my right to an attorney. Though Almer said he went over this orally, I say that nobody read it to me, and I didn't read it myself because of the state I was in. The form was on the table, and I simply signed it. Almer said it took me 3 to 5 minutes to read and sign it, but the judge interrupted him to wonder out loud whether I could have read the form and digested the information in a time frame of 5 minutes. He took a look at the form himself, and then he pointed out that even as a lawyer, it took him 38 to 40 seconds to read the consent for the test. There's Detective Lieutenant Herbert Almers demonstrating polygraph, which he tested Harry De La Roche Jr. Lieutenant Almers also said that he told me Ronnie's body had been found before I took the test. I don't remember it this way, and according to what I recall, I wasn't told in so many words till after I had the test. When Lieutenant Almers described the test, he said that when it ended, it was quite evident by the charts that my answers were deceptive and that I'd killed my family. I told Harry the polygraph charts indicated he was lying, and as far as I was concerned, he had murdered his mother and father and 2 brothers. Almers declared. Then I asked him if he wanted to tell the truth. A second later, he asked, "How much time can I get for the murders?" Almers maintained that after I learned I failed the test, I confessed to 4 shootings and described what I'd done in vivid detail. He said my eyes filled up with tears when I talked about Eric's death. Then he told the court that after this oral statement, I agreed to give a similar account under oath to a court stenographer. I took the stand in my own defense at the Miranda hearing, and I noticed 2 of my father's cousins were at the trial that day. In my 90 minutes on the stand, I testified that I was confused, bewildered, and tired when I confessed to the killings. I don't recall very much, I said, but then I was getting pretty out of it. In his summary at the hearing, John insisted the confession was the product of my physical and mental fatigue, and that the police isolated me and weakened my resistance by denying me proper access to my relatives and pastor while I was being interrogated. Oh, man. He said I'd been psychologically beaten during the 8 hours of intensive grilling, and that before admitting the murders, I had not knowingly or voluntarily surrendered my constitutional rights. Harry didn't know what rights he had, John explained. There are many forms of torture in this world besides the iron boot or the thumbscrew. Richard Salkin, who often appeared fairly low-key, argued that the authorities took great pains to make sure the rights were given. Miranda was not intended to dictate to police that they should do everything in their power not to get a confession, he declared. The police treated this young man fairly, but this man never shut up. He kept talking all day. After the summaries, the court was recessed while Judge Madden made his decision, and during the 15 minutes he said he would need for that, the reporters and TV people passed the time of day by taking monetary bets on what the decision would be. At 3:10, Judge Madden announced that he would admit the confession into evidence except for a reference to the polygraph examination, which he ordered stricken from the confession to keep that information from the jury. Later, he read his reason based upon other rulings that would validate his. The following is an excerpt from his 6-page ruling. The state has met its burden. The totality of the circumstances lead the court to believe that the police not only acted properly but showed sound investigatory practice. The defendant, although only 18 years of age, appeared to be coherent, intelligent, and aware of the situation which confronted him. Notwithstanding the fact he had been awake since 8 a.m. The previous day. He never asked for sleep, never asked for food, nor indicated at any time that he wanted questioning to stop. No argument is made that there was any physical coercion, and this court is convinced that the totality of the circumstances do not support a conclusion that the defendant's will was overborne by psychological coercion. A point was made by the defendant that he was not allowed to see his aunt and uncle and his pastor. This is not in and of itself conclusive. In the total picture, it appears that the defendant was of the age of majority, apparently coherent, and at the time willing to cooperate, and therefore this is not a fatal flaw. In the state's case, State versus McKnight, 52, New Jersey, 35, 1968, State v. Graham, 59, New Jersey, 366, 1971. The only apparent opportunity for the defendant to have been allowed to see his aunt, uncle, and pastor was at the end of the sworn statement concluding at 12:45 p.m. By their own testimony, Pastor Nielsen and John Greer were not present at the police department. They had gone to notify Harry Jr.'s grandparents. Further, at this time, Harry had become a suspect and had agreed to take a lie detector test. Apparently, his aunt did not pressure anyone to see Harry after she saw him at a distance at the Montvale police station. The police did not act improperly, State v. Smith, 32, New Jersey, 501, 1960. In conclusion, the state has met its burden in demonstrating beyond a reasonable doubt that the Miranda warnings were given and that the effectiveness of the defendant's waiver of these rights was not diminished by physical or psychological coercion. The confession is admitted. People in court kept saying I seemed too cool and calm, but when Judge Madden admitted that confession, I reacted so strongly I wanted to throw the water pitcher that sat in front of me. The admission was a triumph for the prosecution, but devastating for the defense. As John said in an interview with Lucinda Fleeson, A reporter for the Record, "The apple has been baked. Now I've got to take it out of the oven and try to repolish it." As soon as the judge gave his decision, the jury was brought back in, and Frank Del Prete read the second sworn statement. I stared at the wall while he read it, and John, in an effort to be supportive, clasped me by the shoulder and said, We'd do all we could." On the following day, John cross-examined Del Prete, and there was much discussion about whether 10 or 11 bullets were fired the night of the shootings. I loaded the gun with 10 bullets when I planned to go to the range. But there was an extra bullet in the chamber, and we don't know who put it in. The state says 10 bullets were fired, but John and I say 11. In arguing for 11, John counted 2 in my mother, 2 in my father, 1 that missed my father and made a hole in the pillow, mattress and a wooden part of the bed, 1 in Ronnie, 2 in Eric, 1 under Eric's bed, 1 inside Eric's t-shirt, and 1 under Eric's body on the floor. The prosecution's count is 10 because the state believes that the second bullet that was fired at my father came out of his eye and made the hole in the pillow, mattress, and wood. But there was no blood by the bullet hole, which seems to be extremely unusual. After introducing more than 100 pieces of physical evidence, the color photographs of the bodies, the bullets, and the blood-stained bedding and clothing, the prosecution wrapped up its case with the second statement to police, the most incriminating piece of evidence against me. 20 witnesses, most of them police officers, had testified for the prosecution. And that's the end of Section 34. And that's all for this reading. Goodbye, bruv.